This morning, as you can see, I'm going to be speaking on dead dreams can live. It's actually the inspiration for this has come from a book that I first read probably 30 years ago. But it's a book that I've kept returning to throughout my life. It's a very simple book. It takes about 2 hours to read it. But it's all about your dreams. And actually, coming into today, I actually had 2 things that I was thinking about preaching on. And then last Saturday, God said, no, I don't want you to preach on any of those. I want you to preach on what you've learned from this book. And Sunday, what a fantastic message that was from Barney last week. Yeah, about failure. Failure is not an option. How failure is not the opposite of success. It's part of our success. And that, for me, it was just confirmation that this is what God wants me to share with you this morning. Now, I said to Matthew this morning, we don't get to preach that often like him. So we don't have the opportunity to be able to just say, we'll follow this on till next week. So if it takes 3 hours, it takes 3 hours. But I promise I'll try and have you out of here by 3 o'clock. So, anyway, this book, it was a book by a good friend of mine, actually. It was somebody that I worked with, David Matthew. He was a pastor at Church House Fellowship in Bradford, which later became Life Church. And I'm going to give him the credit for a lot of this, because as I remember one of my old pastors, Paul Scanlon, saying, the first time you preach a message, if you've pinched ideas from somebody else, always give credit the first time you speak it. After that, it's mine. Okay, so first time, we'll give David the credit. Anytime in the future, it's mine. Okay, so dreams. We all have them, don't we? Now, sometimes our dreams, they might be in response to eating a cheese sandwich at night. But sometimes those dreams can be given directly from God. Now, dreams of the first kind, they tend to be a mashed up account of bits and pieces of information in our subconscious. So I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, I had a dream that myself and Carmen went to Scarborough for the day with my dad. We had a fantastic day. We laughed and we laughed all day. We had fun. We went on the rides. And at the end of the day, we finished it off with a meal in my favourite Italian restaurant on the beach. Now, there are 2 things about that dream that make me realise that it was nonsense. The first one is that the restaurant we ate at was actually in Tenerife, not in Scarborough. See, an example of how our dreams can be a bit of a mishmash of subconscious information. And then the second thing, which I guess was the biggie, is the fact that my dad died in 1997, and I didn't meet Carmen until 18 years later. So how we would have gone to Scarborough together, who knows? Now, in 1963, political activist Martin Luther King declared, "I have a dream." Now, he wasn't talking about the kind of dream I've just mentioned. He was referring to it more in terms of vision, a desire, an aspiration. You see, he had a burning desire to see black people standing shoulder to shoulder as equals with their white counterparts. Now, I don't want to dismiss that first lot of dreams completely. Because sometimes those God-given dreams can come to us through an actual sleeping dream. I'm sure you can all think of somebody in the Bible that happened to. You see, Joseph, he had a dream. He dreamt about sheaves of corn, the sun and the moon and the stars, all bowing before him. And from that, he had a dream. His vision, his belief was that he was destined for leadership. Now, for the sake of today, I'm going to assume that you all know the story of Joseph. If you don't, you can read it for yourself in Genesis. But I'm going to assume that you all know the story. We're going to be dipping in and out of it a little bit as we go through this morning. For most of us, though, our dreams, in the wider sense of that term, they can form more gradually, over a period of time, a growing conviction in our hearts about the call of God on our lives. However, there is one thing which is true for everybody, and that is that without dreams, we can't live. It tells us in Proverbs 29, verse 18, that where there is no vision, the people perish. Because you see, dreams, visions, they give us a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, something that we can strive towards. But without dreams, our minds become dull. They lack that sense of adventure and excitement. So ask yourself, what is your vision? What is it that God has called you to accomplish in life? If you don't feel that you've got a vision, ask God to reveal it to you. As you read his word, during your prayer times, even during the mundane activities of the day. Maybe your dream has already been fulfilled. Well, ask God to give you a new dream. Maybe it was a dream to raise a family. And now all your children have grown up and moved away from home. Ask God, what is the next step for me in my life? Doesn't matter how old or how young you are, you can be 100% certain that God has got a dream for you. It was, after all, him who created us. And as we've just read, he knows that without a dream, we will stagnate. Maybe you once had a dream, but the circumstances of life have taken hold, and that dream has taken a back seat, or it's even been pushed aside completely. In a sense, that dream has died. You may even think to yourself, I had a dream once, and, I really thought it was from God, but it didn't work out. I must have been mistaken. Well, just because your dream has died, it doesn't mean it wasn't from God in the first place. John 12, verse 24 says, "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." Because sometimes Things have to die in order that they can come back to life. You see, we sometimes have a very simplistic view, a misplaced idea that if God gives us a dream, it's all going to somehow miraculously click into place, just like that. But in reality, more often than not, things don't work out the way that we expect them to. There may be difficulties that stand in the way of our dreams being fulfilled. Now, such problems and obstacles, they place you in good biblical company. Let's take a closer look at Joseph's story. He was 17 when he had his dream. Sheaves of corn, sun, moon, stars bowing down to him. And as I said before, his belief was that he was destined for a prominent leadership role. However, he wasn't very wise about how he handled his dream. He was quite cocky about them, strutting around with his richly ornamented coat that his father had given him as a sign of special approval. Is it any wonder that his brothers disliked him? Filled with jealousy, they threw Joseph into a pit, plotting to kill him. But thinking better of it, they instead sold him to some passing traders, who then took him to Egypt and sold him as a slave. You see, Joseph had a dream of leadership, but in reality, it was exactly the opposite. Moses, his dream was to deliver the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. But as soon as he acted on that dream, he took the side of an Israelite in an argument against an Egyptian. Things went badly wrong. And Moses ended up fleeing the country. He, in effect, he became a fugitive. And he went to Midian, which was miles away from the people that he believed he was going to release. And he became a sheep farmer. Completely different to the dream that God had given him. Abraham, God told him he was going to be the father of many nations. Now, it didn't help that he and his wife Sarah were childless. And not only that, they were near centenarians. Yeah? His dream died before it had even started. But God gave them a dream. So what about us? What kind of circumstances can actually be responsible for killing our dreams? Well, the first one, people. People can be responsible for killing our dreams. When I was teaching, I often used to hear colleagues saying, you know, this job would be wonderful if it wasn't for the children. And maybe you've said the same. You know, it would be really easy, fantastic serving God if people didn't keep getting in the way. But you know, just like in a school is full of children, we operate in a world full of people. And people will get in our way. Sometimes other people's response to our dreams could be down to jealousy. They might pick holes in our dreams. They might try and kill our dreams. They may pick holes in our ideals. You're never going to be able to do that. That's impossible. Whatever we think, we might be really excited, we're really encouraged about this calling of God on our lives. But rest assured, other people have a habit of bringing us back down to earth and making us maybe just think again about what God has told us. Look at Joseph. I mean, come on, it wasn't his fault that he was born to Jacob's favourite wife. It wasn't his fault that he'd been given such gifting from God. He didn't ask for it. God gave him those gifts. But despite that, despite the fact that Joseph couldn't be held responsible for either the circumstances of his parentage or the gifts that he'd got, that didn't stop his stepbrothers or his brothers from hating him. They couldn't say a kind word about him. So perhaps you face jealousy from people around you. Maybe they've done their best to put you in your place. And before long, that type of opposition can actually grind you down. It can make you ashamed of the gifts that God had given you. You may even start to play them down or even try and hide them altogether. And if that kind of opposition isn't bad enough, people also have the habit of letting us down. There's nothing worse than being let down by somebody that you trusted. See, even Jesus, he spent 3 years pouring his life and teaching into the disciples. And then, in Gethsemane, when Jesus was arrested, the time that he needed them more than ever, Matthew 26:56 tells us that the disciples deserted him and fled. They let him down. Joseph, when he was in jail, he translated the dreams of the butler and the baker. And we all know how that ended up. The butler released and got his job back. And he said to Joseph, "I'll put a good word in for you on the outside." The minute he was released, he forgot about him completely. And Joseph was still in prison 2 years later. So people can be a factor in the death of our dreams. So how can we overcome that? Well, quite simply, put your trust in God. See, the Bible tells us in Hebrews 13 that God has said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." So we can say with confidence that the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? And in Romans 8:28, now we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In Isaiah 41:10-13, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen and uphold you with my righteous hand. All who rage against you will surely be ashamed and disgraced. Those who oppose you will be as nothing and perish. Though you search for your enemies, you will not find them. those who wage war against you will be as if they were nothing at all. For I am your God, the Lord your God, who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, do not fear, I will help you. So spend time with God. Read his word. Pray. Put your trust in him. Yes, he wants us to work with other people. He wants us to trust other people. But if you stake everything that you've got on other people and they let you down, your life crumbles. But put your trust in God, because he will never let you down. Okay, second thing that might kill our dreams: patience, or as I've put there, the lack of patience. You see, we live in a world where we've got fast food, we've got next day or even same day deliveries, we've got instant coffee, we've got instant everything. We want everything right now. I've even heard of people praying to God, God, give me patience. And if you don't mind, I'll have it now. You see, we can cope with most things, but waiting, whoa. So when God gives us a vision, we want it to jump straight into its fulfillment. But you know what? God is not in a hurry. It tells us in 2 Peter 3, verse 8, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. He's got all the time in the world. And I'm sorry to say, but there's no such thing as instant dream fulfillment. Even Jesus didn't start his public ministry until he was 30 years old. But we can actually assume from the fact that he was in the temple preaching at the age of 12 that the vision had already formed in his life. That's a wait of 18 years. He had to wait 18 years before he entered in to what God had called him to do. Abraham, he waited 1/4 of a century. All natural hope fading fast before Isaac was born. Moses, he was sheep farming in the back and beyond for over 40 years before God told him that it was his time. And as for Joseph, calculations say that it's about 23 years between him having his initial dream and his family coming to Egypt and bowing before him. You see, it's quite normal for there to be a delay between receiving the dream and seeing it fulfilled. So no matter how long you've been waiting, you can be assured you've not been overlooked by God. Your dream will come to fruition in his timing. So, people and delay are often the major factors that cause our dreams to die. But now let's turn our attention to why does God even allow them to die? I'm going to suggest maybe 4 reasons why this could be the case. Firstly, God wants to test your faith. He wants to know how serious you are about seeing your dreams through to fulfillment. Are you going to knock and keep knocking? for maybe 40, 50, 60 years if you have to? Or are you just going to knock on the door and when nobody answers, turn around and go home? You see, things that are of value are tested. I used to work for an engineering company. We made pistons and piston rings for all of the major car manufacturers. Whenever there was a new prototype vehicle, or even just a slight change to a piston design, these things had to be tested. We had test beds up on Neville Road in Bradford, and we used to put pistons and piston rings through hours and hours and hours of testing to see if they would stand up to the rigours of being on the road. Now, sometimes it would be in a simulated manner. Other times, the car manufacturers would provide us with a vehicle to test them on. Often a top-of-the-range model with all the mod cons. It's heartbreaking having to take them to the tip afterwards and watch as they were being crushed because now they had a non-standard piston in them and the company wouldn't allow them back on the road. But you see, we had to test them. I know for a fact I wouldn't want to drive a car that hadn't been properly tested. And it's the same when God gives us a dream. He wants to know that that dream is in safe hands and that we're not just going to give up at the first sign of trouble. In James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." And 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7, "These have come so that your faith, which is of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved to be genuine." God wants to test our faith. The second reason that He might allow your dream to die is to develop your character. Now, don't mistake character for gifting. You see, at the age of 17, there was absolutely no doubt that Joseph was gifted. However, we can see from his actions, the way he boasted about his gifts, the way he paraded around in a coat, he lacked the character to be able to handle the gifts that he'd been entrusted with. You could say, at that time, he was an immature little creep. So God allowed his dream to die. He took away his coat and he removed him from the protective hand of his father. Thrown into the pit of adversity, Joseph had to grow up. And he had to grow up fast. He had no idea how difficult things were going to be. And he especially didn't know how difficult things were going to be once he'd reached his goal. But God did. And God knew that he would need to develop the character to be able to handle it. The third thing that God might be looking at is he might be wanting to teach you, to learn to be a servant. You know, we all know that person, don't we, who loves to be the centre of attention. Might even be you. I mean, go on, admit it. We all like to have the focus on ourselves from time to time. My mum was a bit like that. I'd go around and see her on an evening, and every time I went, I'd get a full catalogue of all the aches and pains that she'd got, how poorly she was feeling, and how hard things were for her. I remember going round one time, and Les was sat in his chair, and I said, "Les, how are you today?" And he said, "I've not been feeling too good the last couple of days." To which my mum responded, "Yes, but you're not as bad as I am." Taking that focus back onto herself. Now, my grandma, my mum's mum, she had all the same ailments that my mum had. And added to that, she'd been deaf for as long as I could remember. But for her, she loved having people round. She loved to hear what your day had been like. She loved to know all the things that had been going on in people's lives. When you went to see her, her focus was 100% on you, not on her problems. Okay? It's a difference. Now, I'm not doing my mum down there. She was a wonderful lady, and there was a lot of really positive things about her, but that was just one thing that she did like, to have that attention on herself. Now, examine your dream for a minute. When it comes to fulfillment, do you envisage people noticing you? Do you see people admiring you? Do you see people serving you? Joseph did. At the age of 17, his focus was 100% on himself. How great he was going to be. But God doesn't give you a vision for your own self-importance. He gives it so that you can be a blessing to other people. Only a person who has truly learned to serve can truly handle being served. A few weeks ago, when we were at the leadership convention in Manchester, Pastor Alan shared about the centurion who Jesus met on the road, and he said, "My servant's at home." He said, "Will you heal him?" Jesus said, "Yes, I'll come and I'll heal him." And the centurion said, "I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. And that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." Now notice that he didn't say, "I am a man in authority." He said, "I am a man under authority." You see, he understood his authority came down the line, ultimately from Caesar. And in turn, he represented Caesar to the men that were under him. Or if we switch that around, the people served him because he served those that were above him. Even Jesus, he worked as an employee in his father's carpentry business. And then later, he served his mother when she was widowed, looking after her. And even after he'd entered full-time ministry, or fully into his ministry, we read in Matthew 20 that he said, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." Now, I remember my first ever job. I worked for a company, Harvest Time. Some of you may have heard of them. They were a Christian publishing company based here in Bradford. They were actually the company that published the book that I mentioned earlier. My boss, a man called Neil Marlowe, his job title was General Manager, and he was responsible for everything that went on in the day-to-day running of that company. But he wasn't the kind of manager that'd sit behind his desk shouting out instructions to everybody. He was a very hands-on sort of manager. When there was a mail out to be done with our bi-monthly magazine, he'd roll his sleeves up with everybody else and he'd be stuffing envelopes. He was often seen unloading trailers at the delivery bay or answering the phone in reception. He would never ask anybody to do anything that he wasn't willing to do himself. Now, I can honestly say it was a real privilege to serve under such a man. And I've always said that he was the best boss I've ever worked for in my entire life. And myself, I've always tried to follow his example. And in fact, a real highlight of my career, when I was, again with this engineering company, I was in IT, and I had the role of global team lead within a major multinational organisation. And one of my team told me that I wasn't like any of her previous managers. In fact, I was the best boss she had ever had. And my response to her was, "You've got a man called Neil Marlowe to thank for that." Because my actions came from the actions and from seeing the actions of my boss. Now, Joseph, he had no option. He had to learn to serve. He was purchased in Egypt by a wealthy businessman, Potiphar, and was set to work serving in his master's household. As the new boy, he would have undoubtedly been given the tasks that none of the other servants liked. He was maybe mucking out the stables and things like that. But he chose not to wallow in his own self-pity. He served his master with everything that he had. And he soon rose through the ranks within the household. Later, he was imprisoned for something that he didn't do. But again, he served the prison warder and even his fellow prisoners. By this time, he was undoubtedly serving because he wanted to, not because he had to. You see, his character was being nicely developed. Perhaps the reason that your dream hasn't been fulfilled yet is because you haven't yet learned to be humble and to serve. So how do we become humble? Well, it's quite simple, really. By serving others and putting them first. You see, Scripture makes it clear that becoming humble is a do-it-yourself job. It tells us in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6. It says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." And again in James 4, verse 10, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up." You see, we do the humbling so that God can lift us. Don't ask God to humble you. You might regret it if you do. Jesus himself, when he washed the disciples' grubby feet, he said, I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Learn to be a servant. Okay, the fourth reason for why your dream may to die is so that you can get rid of any preconceived ideas for how it may come about. Let's go back to 17-year-old Joseph. I'm sure he'd thought it all through in his own mind, how his life was going to pan out. But never in a month of Sundays could he have foreseen what actually happened. The reality is that it took over 20 years of allowing his dream to die in order to shake out those preconceived ideas so that God could fulfill the dream his way. Wonder what preconceived ideas God is trying to shake out of our minds. Now, if God's going to allow our dream to die, what should we be doing now in the meantime? You see, we've all heard the sayings, there's no time like the present. Yesterday is done and dusted. Tomorrow never comes. Today is the most important day of your life. So make the most of it. Put your heart into your current responsibilities. Give beyond what is expected of you. Just like Joseph did. He didn't sit and sulk because his dream hadn't been instantly fulfilled. He chose to make the best of his current circumstances and to serve with all his heart. He rose through the ranks within Potiphar's household, and even when things went wrong and he was thrown into prison, he still didn't give up, and he found favour with the prison guards. Later, when he was second in command in the whole of Egypt, it tells us that in Genesis 41:52 that he named his second son Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Now, the circumstances that you're in today might not be conducive to your dream. But wherever you are today, give it everything that you've got, 100%. Remember that God is with you. God is always with you. And he's promised, as we read before, that he will never leave or forsake you. Remember, your dreams will come to fruition in his time. But he'll be no more with you when your dream comes to fruition than he is now. Whilst Joseph was a slave in Potiphar's household, in Genesis 39, verse 2 tells us that the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And then later in verse 21, once he'd been thrown in prison, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, gave him favour in the sight of the keeper of the prison." The Lord was with him, even in those circumstances. Another thing that we can do, practice your dream on a smaller scale now. Maybe God's called you to full-time evangelism. Well, start by sharing Christ with your work colleagues now. Are you called to a healing ministry? Start by praying for the sick in your family or at your workplace. Maybe God's called you to lead a church. Start by leading your family at home and bringing them up correctly. Make a practical connection with your dream in the here and now. Joseph was called to be a leader. He didn't expect to be pushed into slavery. But even then, he determined to be a leader amongst the slaves. As the saying goes, tall oaks from acorns grow. So make a connection in a small way. If you can't speak to the people around you now as about the truth of God and about the goodness of God and about the good message, the good news, how can you expect God to entrust you with a full-time evangelistic ministry? It's as simple as that. It's all part of it. Concentrate on blessing others. And we've already touched on that. We've already talked a lot about that. Concentrate on being a servant, blessing others. It tells us in Matthew 10, verse 39, that whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So don't get eaten up by your own ambitions. Lay them down. Let your dreams die in self-sacrificial sacrifice to others. And when the time is right, and only when the time is right, God moves. And he'll move fast. You see, one moment, Joseph was languishing in prison. Absolutely no hope of release. The next moment, the prison guard was turning the key in the lock, handing him a pile of clothes and a razor, and saying, "Come on, get a move on. You've got a meeting with Pharaoh in 15 minutes. How incredible was that? Moses, he'd been sheep farming for 40 years. And then suddenly he was taken by surprise by the burning bush when God told him, now is the time to go and see Pharaoh and say, let my people go. As for you, your time will come too. Maybe when you least expect it. And won't that be absolutely wonderful? Yeah? All that hurt and anguish, all that opposition, all that waiting. But now we can relax. We can enjoy the fulfillment of our dream. Yes, it will be great, but don't be fooled. It gets harder from here. This is where the hard work really starts. If we look at the servant in Luke 19, in one of Jesus' parables, the servant that was given a single mina and told by his master to put it to work. And then when the master called him back at the appointed time, that single mina had earned him another 10 minas. And it tells us in verse 17 of Luke 19 that the master responded, "Well done, my good servant," his master replied. "Because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, you can take early retirement, a big fat pension, a villa by the sea, and all the free food that you could possibly eat." Great, isn't it? But you know what? His master didn't say that at all. His master said, because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, here, take charge of 10 cities. a much, much bigger and more difficult task. Joseph, suddenly, he was made second in command over the whole of Egypt. He had the responsibility of overseeing the storage, the collection and storage of food during the years of excess. And then he had the responsibility to distribute it during the years of famine, making sure that they never ran out and that everybody had sufficient food to eat. Now, could 17-year-old Joseph have handled that? I think not. And that's why God allowed Joseph to go through everything that he did in order to prepare him for the role that he wanted him to fulfill. And you know what? It's the same for you. Your circumstances today are all part of that training ground. To find out if you're serious about your calling. To build the right sort of character. To teach you to serve others. And to get rid of any preconceived ideas that you might have. And in God's timing, your dream can then be fulfilled. Amen.